behind all this was when I was here in October for MKTE. We had a conservation seminar, and Paula and several other people spoke, and Ian Craig said, why can't the tourism industry get more engaged with our conservation efforts? And so Mohanjit and I were sitting there, and I made a small address after that, and we said, we'll give the whole of the Atta seminar to conservation, which is where we are. Of course, it's been slightly superseded by events, and the British High Commissioner was always the first speaker, and had things been otherwise, he would be more on conservation. But we thought carefully about it, and we have decided that he should address the current situation. We're going to ask him some questions. There will be a Q&A on the travel advisory in a minute. First of all, I'd like to thank Tribe Hotel, who've done a fantastic job getting this venue, providing lunch at only 1,500 shillings, which seems to be very cheap. Those who want to stay, and thank Johnny for all his help putting this all together, for having me to stay here, and also for South African Airways who's flying me around. I'm just going to say a few words about where Atta is, because this is sort of an Atta seminar, just to show you very quickly where we're going as an association. We operate in 22 countries, and you can see there's a great sort of swathe of it down the eastern side, but also moving more into Western Africa. And our newest sort of big country that's coming on board is Ethiopia, which seems to be taking over the world by storm, partly because Ethiopian Airways is spreading right across Africa and setting up regional hubs everywhere. So it's all very exciting, but Kenya still remains our biggest membership, partly because it was all started in Kenya in the first place. Tanzania is the second membership and almost the same size as Kenya now. So looking at Atta by category, despite what everybody thinks, in fact 52% of Atta is actually buyers, and 42% suppliers, the rest are sort of miscellaneous airlines and that sort of thing. So buyers are still the biggest section of Atta members. Bearing in mind with that, obviously we include international buyers and DMCs, and I suppose we call the ground operators through Africa, so they're included in that figure. And African buyers are 62%, this is all about buyers. UK buyers 22%, but Europe, UK and Europe is nearly 30%. And that's increasing. North America is small, and one that we will pick up enormously in the next 6 to 9 months is Brazil. We've made a real attack on Brazil. We've got a fantastic rep there, Andrea. She was there for any of you who need to use her, any of you Atta members. And with our new director, Andre Large, who owns Akalanga in Southern Africa, in South Africa. And he moves about 5,000 people here from Brazil into South, and now more into East Africa. We're going to have a very good presence in Brazil. We've been working hard on China, but it hasn't worked. It's just so complicated and so difficult. I spent over Christmas and New Year there working, and it's not really been that successful. And I'm still not exactly sure that the Chinese model fits in with our model in Africa, although I see a statement from KTB that the Chinese are the biggest market now in Masai Mara, which I thought was quite striking. There we are. East Africa is 55%, Southern Africa 43%. Southern Africa is growing. We didn't have any members there a few years ago, so that's a complete change in our whole demographic. And then Africa, 71% of it all. Europe, UK and Europe, 24-25%. So, responsible tourism, it's responsible tourism seminar. It's very much about rhino and elephant conservation, what's going on. 100 elephants now going a day. And I just wanted to say that Atta is now going to work very closely on this whole subject. I was pushed into it actually by people like Paula who wanted to do that. I had a very interesting meeting on Friday with the CEO of World Travel and Tourism Council, and with Charlie Knightley from Tusk. And we're going to start an initiative between all these associations to get together, to get the message across about conservation. I mean, it's a very interesting thing. The WTTC is made up of all the major tourism operations in the world, and they have 130 members. So they're all already really big players in tourism. And I asked them, and in fact I had an email this morning, like, how many of all these members, these huge companies in tourism, would be interested in the rhino and saving the rhino and the elephant and that whole issue. And you've got to remember that they came out with an answer that probably only about 20% are actually even involved in Africa. So, you know, it's not, in world tourism terms, it's not such a big deal, and that's what we're working about. But there's several things we want to do. One is we want to do a lot more research on this whole subject. We want to find out how many people are interested. And a lot of the money that Tusk and I are doing and putting into it, WTC, with our help, is going to go into a whole research project on the subject. And the other thing is obviously about getting the message out. Because again, I mean, we've never really majored on this until now. And the message about the rhino disappearing, and I know the situation in Salou is now unbelievably dramatic. It won't be an infant step at all, the current way it's going. We've really got to do something about that. So this is going to be our initiative over the next year to work with the other organisations across the industry, including UNWTO. But that's complicated too. I was at the meeting at our ITP, they called the ministers. We all went very well until the South African minister and the Zimbabwean minister walked out. And it's all because they can't make the agreement on free trade and they just didn't want to be part of it. So it's very difficult to get all the industry working together, and that's something we're going to try and do. We're a facilitator more than anything else, and we will be working on that. So now I'm going to introduce you to the British High Commissioner, Dr. Christian Turner. He was formerly a director of the Middle East and North Africa. He's had amazing jobs in British government with Private Secretary to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, which must have been interesting indeed. And on the Tony Blair Strategy Unit, as Secretary of the Economic and Domestic Committee of Cabinet, and was first Secretary in the British Embassy in Washington. I just had a meeting with him this morning. He's very passionate about Kenya, his family are out here, and I gather he's now just been here for 2 years, I think, last month. So I'm going to open him with an email I was sent this morning, which is a statement made by the Kenyan ambassador to the United States, Jean Kumar. The scenario was that was a delicate balance to play as Kenya works to draw tourism and create jobs in response to growing religious radicalization and infiltration by militant groups. And she was then asked the question about the US travel advisory by this interviewer. And her response was this. And so I put this to the High Commissioner to perhaps respond in his way from a UK perspective. We're talking here about the United States. Our position in Kenya is that the threat of terrorism is a global issue. What is happening in Kenya is very similar to what is happening in Somalia and recently in Djibouti. We're all faced with the same risk and the same terror organisation. Because of that risk and insecurity, we feel very strongly that the travel advisories that have been renewed by the US and UK government actually work to detriment to the global effort to combat terrorism. It plays right into what the terrorists want. They want to create such a level of insecurity and fear that nobody wants to come to your country, or to Kenya in this case. So that's where we disagree with Washington. So, High Commissioner, I hand the baton over to you to respond.
Well, thank you, Nigel, and a very good, warm and good morning to everybody. I think that's what's technically called a hospital pass, to be set up like that. And I'm also slightly worried to see my name superimposed on what is not only a piece of illegal ivory, but also a knife. So I think I should take the hint, really. It's really good to be here, and I was always planning to come and join you this morning, irrespective of the change in our travel advice. And that's because, like all of you, you cannot live and spend your time here, as I do, without developing a deep love for the country and all that it has to offer. And for many of us, that's about a few key things, at the heart of which is going to be wildlife, and the tourism opportunity that generates. I should say, of course, we're not alone in this. If you'd allow me to name drop, I was in London a couple of weeks back and had the pleasure of a meeting with Prince Charles. I think I can do this bit off the record if I'm allowed to do that. Prince Charles was, of course, asking about the situation in Kenya and his experiences here. And of course, the whole family have deep and strong ties to Kenya. Most recently with Prince William proposing to the Duchess of Cambridge here. But I must share with you the story that His Royal Highness told me about his meeting with the first president, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. And Charles had been here, I think it was 72 or 73, and had traveled around the country and had gone up to Lake Turkana to see the beauty that bit of the north has to offer. And he came back and had his audience with the president. And making small talk at the start of the meeting, said to the Mzee, so, Mr. President, I've just been up to Lake Rudolph. Very, very beautiful. Do you know it? And as he relayed this story, he said there was this deathly silence in the room. And all of the advisors looked very shifty and looked at their feet. And there was a very long pause. And finally, President Kenyatta said, yes, I do know it. I spent a bit of time there at the invitation of your mother. So, if ever I'm having a bad meeting, I can just remember that it could get worse. So listen, what I would like to do is, I'm going to say a few brief remarks. I would actually like to start by saying a few words about conservation and the threat of poaching. I don't want to steal Paula's quite significant thunder. She's speaking to you later, but I want to say a few words about how we're addressing that, and then I'll move on to the insecurity and the travel advice, if that's okay. The reason I want to start with the poaching is because I think fundamentally it is absolutely, it is a crisis. We're talking about it as a crisis, and we should be in no doubt about the urgency and the seriousness of the issue. The shocking headlines continue. I first was involved on the issue about 18 months ago. The news in April that Mountain Bull, one of Kenya's most iconic elephants, was killed, just shows how this is continuing apace. Most of you will know the statistics. An elephant killed every day of the year. Rhino poaching, 5,000% increase. One killed in Africa by a poacher every 10 hours. This is devastating. And the implications for the tourism industry, if the trend continues, I think the figure, Paula, that you use is no elephants left in the wild in 10 years' time. You know, this absolutely deserves our attention. My big message from a government point of view is we should not regard this as a conservation issue. This is not something that should sit in an environment ministry and with a bunch of people who worry about fluffy animals. This is an economic threat to livelihoods. 100 billion shillings is the figure that we use as earnings from tourism to Kenya every year, of which 3/4 must be, broadly speaking, from wildlife. And it's a security issue. We think that the proceeds from illegal trafficking of horn and ivory is probably the fourth largest illicit international activity, and we have to treat it and tackle it in exactly the same way we would for guns, for drugs, for people trafficking, and those other forms of transit. In Africa, it's things like the Elephant Protection Initiative. But it's making absolutely sure that we are treating this as a criminal issue. And third is involving local communities. And I think this plays to the heart of our discussions this morning. And George and I were just talking about the conservancy model pioneered by the likes of the Northern Ranges Trust. That basic approach of putting communities at the heart of conservation, seeing the issue not just as one of protecting wildlife, but of increasing and enhancing security for communities, of providing livelihoods. I think it is absolutely remarkable what is being achieved through that model. There's a suite of other things we're doing internationally, but also here in Kenya. We've been doing quite a lot of work with our criminal justice advisor on the Wildlife Act to make sure that the implementation of that really superb piece of legislation is having full effect. That has included funding for training of all the relevant law enforcement agencies on best practice in investigating and prosecuting wildlife crimes. Just as I'm saying, wildlife cannot be seen as a purely environmental issue internationally in the way we deal with it. That is just as true for domestic jurisdiction. And what we're trying to do is ensure that all of the players in Kenya, whether it's KWS, the prosecutors, the DPP, the whole criminal justice network understands how to use that legislation to its full effect, and interagency cooperation can really happen. There's also a 200,000 project launched with the UN agencies to enforce and strengthen strategy, and perhaps most practically we're using the presence of the British Army here in Kenya to help train KWS and KFS in patrolling fieldcraft and an intelligence-led approach to anti-poaching operations. We are absolutely committed to standing shoulder to shoulder with Kenya to combat terrorism, just as we have done for many years, just as we did during Westgate. This is not a Kenyan issue, it is a global issue, and we have to work together to deal with it. This is not a time for standing apart, it is a time for coming together, and I am absolutely resolved, as is the British government, to carry on doing everything we can to tackle that threat of insecurity and to reduce it. That's where we have to focus our efforts. We want tourism in Kenya to be part of a growing and vibrant industry of more visitors coming to Kenya to see and enjoy all that it has to offer. So I finish with the word partnership. Much of what I talk about in Kenya is actually about partnership. It's about the deep and historic ties between our two countries, and whether it's tackling wildlife crime, whether it is tackling terrorism, we want to work in partnership to promote Kenyan prosperity and security. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. He founded tropical places. He's been a pioneer in setting up wildlife conservancies on the land lease from Maasai communities, adjacent to parks and reserves. He's been chairman of the Eco-Tourism Society in Kenya, on the board of Kenya Wildlife Service, chairman of the KTF, and served 2 terms as chairman of the Kenya Tourist Board. He's a, I would say he was a moron. He says he's a moron. He's a moron in burning spear.
Thank you.
State recommendation. So, Jake, over to you. And you've only got 30 minutes, Jake.
Right. Synchronized watches. Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And today we're talking about the linkage between tourism and conservation. And that is something that's particularly important in this country. Now, I don't know how many of you read the publication Scientist, but right now they're saying that we're heading for the sixth extinction. The number of species going extinct are 1,000 times greater than they were before mankind appeared. So the world is in a bit of a dire state, and it's primarily due to loss of habitat and the huge explosion in global population. The Kenyan elephant and rhino poaching is a national crisis. We see continual pictures of what's going on. The numbers are known to all of us. Richard Leakey said that this is a crisis that will make them extinct within the country if it's allowed to continue. So what are the main reasons for the decline of wildlife globally? What are the reasons for the decline in Kenya? Primarily, it's the massive increase in human population in the past 100 years. And that increase in human population has resulted in a number of activities which are causing the wildlife to disappear. The habitat loss is a major factor, and environmental damage caused by man. Secondly, human-wildlife conflict, and thirdly, irresponsible or unregulated hunting. And fourthly, overexploitation. It may be legal overexploitation, or it could be illegal, in other words, poaching of wildlife and natural resources for commercial gain. There are other causes: climate change, loss of genetic diversity, introduction of alien species, disease, but none of those are having the same impact as habitat loss and killing at the hands of man. But tourism and wildlife conservation in Kenya are intertwined, and codependent. And we must be part of the solution too, those of us in the tourist industry. We need to join with the conservationists and rally against poaching, but also we need to use responsible tourism to generate incomes for protection of wildlife habitat. There are many Kenyans who've been standing up and speaking out in favor of cracking down on poaching. The Kenya Tourism Federation has an environmental committee. Their role is to lobby, and we need to add our voices. And we also need to talk to each other. Some of the conservation organizations exclude the tourist industry. We found out almost by mistake when Chania from Kelly and Peacock sent out an email saying there's a demonstration in Nairobi. It was too late for most of us to be involved. But we rallied with KTF and MCTA, and Mohammed Hersi led a large delegation of colleagues at the coast. So we in tourism want to be involved in playing a role, but we all need to work together, and we need to speak to each other. Now, I was talking about responsible tourism and income. This is where, quietly behind the scenes, we can get on with running our businesses in a responsible way, and we can make a difference. It's not all about being agitators and shouting and getting publicity and PR. We can quietly get on with running our businesses in a responsible and ethical and sustainable way, and that can make a huge difference to conservation in this country. The income from tourism is absolutely vital for the continued operation of Kenya's parks and reserves. KWS depends greatly on tourism to run the parks. I would suggest that KWS needs to look at a word we often hear in Southern Africa, which doesn't really apply here, and that's concessions. Here, our conservancies are not really concessions. They're being leased. Concessions are large areas that probably belong to a government or local authority that can be hired or rented or leased or secured for a safari operator. And within Tsavo is vast. I think KWS should be giving concessions within Tsavo National Park to some tourism partners to have 100,000 acres or so within Tsavo to run their own exclusive product. Because otherwise you're mixing up all kinds of different levels of tourism in one place. But in addition to the national parks and national reserves under KWS and the county governments, there's been a move in recent years in Kenya to develop other wildlife tourism products. The first conservancies were established by people like the Craig family on Lewa, and the others followed in Laikipia. So the conservancies in the Laikipia area. The Olchoro Orogwa was set up in the Mara by Chief Olen Tutu, and Willie Roberts had a lot of input in terms of management and advice. That was a new departure where an area was set aside as a conservancy with the income not going to the county council but going to the landowners. And camps on group ranches were pioneered by people like Richard Bonham and other safari operators on different group ranches in the country. Seasonal campsites on the former Kayaki group ranch were also in place. But the problem now is that with the popularity of the Mara, there was massive overdevelopment in that area. So quite recently, there's been a movement to establish conservancies on land leased from individual landowners in the outer Mara ecosystem as a solution to the overdevelopment. The overdevelopments within the Mara Reserve, ribbon developments along the boundaries near the gates, especially Talek, Sekanani, areas of Siana, they've resulted in high-density tourism. There was only one lodge and 128 beds in the 1960s in the Mara. And I started my career in 1972 in the Mara. There was no other lodge apart from Kikarot where I was. It was before the days of governors, before the days of Sereno or anybody else. Today, if you look on TripAdvisor, there's about 160 different camps and lodges listed, and probably that adds up to about 7,000 beds. And so you get this overcrowding by minivans. We've all seen the pictures of the masses of vehicles drawn up along the Mara River at the time of the migration. And it's awful. It's not the kind of experience that visitors want, and it does us a lot of harm in terms of negative publicity. Most recently, there's been a movement to establish conservancies on land leased from individual landowners in the outer Mara as one solution to the overdevelopment. This is what the Mara used to look like in terms of the big group ranches, the Mara Triangle, the Mara Reserve, Koyaki, Siana, and then outlying areas. Some of the furthest outlying were turned over to wheat. But the big change came about with subdivision. So what a number of us managed to do was to lease land within that subdivided area and have it set aside as wildlife conservancies. And many of us are in this together. And the big deal is to have these individual conservancies joined together so that they form one continuous area that's under conservation, connected to the Mara and connected to the Serengeti. And that's what we've been aiming for. But within the conservancies, we have a strict formula which prevents lodges springing up and is under the control of the people who lease the land. So the three key elements of the conservancy are, number one, environment. We need to stop the degradation of the Mara ecosystem, reverse the decline in wildlife, increase biodiversity, allow the recovery of the wildlife habitat, conserve the animals, birds, and plants. Secondly, we need to take account of the fact that that land belongs to people and the community need to get benefits and an income from the conservancies. So the Maasai landowners have genuine and meaningful benefits from allowing their lands to be used for wildlife conservation. Those benefits are in the form of rental payments and they're in the form of priority in employment. The responsible tourism is the key, because the money for paying for leasing, the money for paying for generating benefits from the community comes from tourism. And creating a new form of tourism that gives our tourist industry a boost by providing a better experience for visitors and which avoids the high-density minibus safari for which Kenya has been criticized in the park. Those three aspects are the triple bottom line. And the conservancy concept has a number of key features. First of all, there must be a limit. We must have some definition of what is a conservancy, because everybody in the Mara who builds a new lodge now says they're in a 20-acre conservancy. That's the 20-acre plot they've leased. There has to be some sort of minimum size, some sort of definition. Our definition is that a conservancy should be at least 7,000 acres of community land, made up of individual parcels, leased and all put together to form the conservancy, set aside exclusively for wildlife, with no human settlement, no bomas. The payment also is per acre. It's not per tourist. This is important, because when you have a payment per tourist, the drive is for more tourists. The fact that we limit the numbers of beds and the numbers of vehicles, and no more than 12 units, rooms or tents per camp. So what are the positive effects? There's definitely have been major positive effects. First of all, the payments are received directly by the individual landowners, not via a committee with a chance the money can go adrift. They like that. Employment opportunities for landowner families. Many people have jobs now in the conservancies and the camps or as rangers who would never have had a job because of the priority we give them. The land improves significantly. Vegetation and grass regenerates. There's no tree cutting, there's no ploughing. Continued ownership is vested in the hands of the individual title deed holder, so they're not selling their land. And they're involved and participate. The landowners are involved in the conservancy. As a result, we have much lower density, 1 or 2 vehicles at a time. We have seen rhino back in OMC, and the numbers of elephants that we see coming into Naibosho and Olkinye. We need to tell the world about our attractions. We need to use social media from our hundreds of thousands of visitors who come here and are very happy to spread the message about why they love Kenya. We need to keep our tourists coming. We can't afford to see our industry close down and have all of us going out of business and the huge impact that would have on our economy. Well, security, terrorism and travel advisories, we all listened keenly to the High Commissioner, and I don't think we quarrelled with what he had to say. The industry needs to recognise the concerns about security. It's no good trying to say that it's just the same everywhere else. Terrorism is a global threat, but we need to see how we can engage with the government and how we can engage with the embassies to address the anxieties so that the ban on non-essential travel can be lifted. That is important for us, because draconian warnings are one thing, giving people the chance to make up their own mind, but actually preventing our tour operator customers overseas from sending us clients is another thing. So we need to see how can we work with with the government, and how can we come together, and how can we speak even to the private sector security companies, which must be one of the best businesses to be involved in right now. I think that there is room for improvement.
Thank you so much. Lovely to see everybody, old friends, young friends, excellencies. But let's get straight into it. When I told Angie I was coming to this conference, she said, "What's it about?" And I wasn't 100% sure, but what I do know is that this is a moment in Kenya's history where we need to pull together more than ever. We have friends all around the world. We have people who want to visit Kenya. We've got some who are already doing it, and we've got some probably sitting thinking about it, who we're going to persuade to come here. So Angie's challenge was this, and I pass it on to you. Everybody here today needs to answer the question, which is, why are we here? And what can we do individually to actually go away from this meeting? And I think this is so important. And by the end of today, have done something relevant to what we heard or thought about or wanted to do. If we do that, then that idea of, are you going to action this, will make some sense. So let's sort of put it into practice. I just wanted to show you this very quickly because Jake spoke about numbers, and a good friend in the African Lion Working Group, Nobi Yamaguchi, who is a very funky guy, he sent me this little, what would you call it? You scientists? Anyway, it basically shows us, this is Earth's land mammals by weight. Okay, the dark blotch probably taking up a quarter of the space on Earth are the humans. So let's get that in our heads. We know there's billions. And then around, on the right here, all the right-hand side is our cattle. So this is what's occupying our world. And then here you've got pigs. So here you've got pigs, then you've got goats, then you've got sheep, then you've got horses. And you see these three little spots down here? That's our 450, maybe 500,000 elephants. So by relative, degrees, we've taken up an awful lot of our Earth. Do we need reminding how important tourism is to conservation? I remember when I first went to live in the Mara in 1977, Tanzania closed its border, and the Mara suddenly was no longer a stopover, which Jake would have remembered, of people coming through Kikorok Lodge on their way back from Serengeti, having seen the Big Five and then whizzing past Nakuru and into Nairobi, as I did on my overland trip. The Mara really wasn't even something that people thought about. They wouldn't have even probably remembered its name. Suddenly, the border closed, Mara benefited, Kenya benefited. What happened to Tanzania? 1977 to 83, the border closed. Tanzanians had good reason to do that. They wanted to regain their tourist industry. We can't blame them for that. But what happened in terms of numbers? The Serengeti, 50 to 70,000 visitors went down to 10,000. Poaching went through the roof. I was down there in the 80s working on wild dogs, wildebeest migration. There wasn't enough spares or fuels to man the anti-poaching. 4,000 elephants, I may be wrong on the numbers, it was about that number, was reduced to perhaps less than 2,000. The rhinos disappeared. Meat poaching went through the roof. So we don't need reminding, we've actually got a precedent to look at. And this isn't knocking Tanzania, it's a wonderful country with a wonderful resource, which is hurting right now because of what's hurting us, bad publicity. But the fact is, we cannot think that tourism doesn't fund the bill for wildlife, because believe me, it does. The conservancies that Jake talked about, those guys who are making a deal with the Maasai and putting money into their pockets, a fairer value for their land offset, that will not survive if tourists don't come, because with all the goodwill in the world of the tour operators, it's based on economics. Now, here's me saying why I love Kenya, and why it's such an important place to me, and why there is nowhere else on earth. I came right through Africa, I've traveled around the world. This, to me, is the most amazing country. But not everybody thinks like that. And I would say to us, if we're going to take this opportunity for which it offers us, we won't sit here and say to ourselves, we've got a problem, everybody's turning on us, saying bad things about us, we need to tell people what's good about us, we also need to examine our industry and see where we can make changes. Because if we do, we will go back to the public, not only to change their perceptions about Kenya, but also about our industry. So for instance, why is it that our guides don't have to have, as a minimum, a bronze award or standard from the Kenya Association of Professional Guides? Everywhere in Africa, where you have an industry as important as ours, the guides have to have something which says that they will tell the visitors information which is correct, know how to manage their visitors. We could do a lot better in that respect. I think that's something we need to look at. Secondly, the place that I call my second home has been dying for a management plan ever since I've been there. I was asked by one of the NGOs in 1977 to contribute to a management plan, or the creation of information for the management plan. Ian Douglas Hamilton wrote a report actually stating all the different management plans that had been proposed for the Mara but never acted upon. Now, I would love to think that at this time of crisis, if we're looking to do a good job with PR, we start saying to people some of the things that we are doing to make our industry even better. And we all know that one of the things that we could share with the world, and hopefully this will come out of meetings that are taking place with the new Narok County, that we have a management plan and management of the reserve that we can show to people that we're taking seriously just what a gift the Mara is to this country. Now listen to this, because this is so important. The world is littered with beautiful places that lure vacationers. Many have beaches, sunshine, great food, and lovely people. And don't we have lovely people, just as Kenya does. However, Kenya's amazing wildlife is its advantage over all those other destinations, because Kenya's wildlife is, truthfully, what really defines us in the eyes of the rest of the world. I love this country. I know you do too. We can affect change, but we will only do it by talking with the right people, by sending out the right message, and by being courageous. And if I get knocked on the head at this age, don't ever think I didn't have a great life. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an extraordinary privilege to speak to you all about something that is very, very close to my heart, and I'm sure to all of you, and especially those Kenyans who have grown up with these extraordinary, spectacular animals. We take it for granted that elephants, rhinos, lions, leopards, hyenas, giraffes will always be there. Well, the way things are going, and I really fear that our country has not been very honest with us, the way things are going, they will not be around for that much longer. In this country, I think we're so privileged because we can go out on any day, even from the city of Nairobi. Within a few hours, you could be in Amboseli surrounded by these magnificent animals. The Kenya government took a very strong stand in the 1980s when elephant poaching had driven populations of elephants in this country down to 16,000, down from about 160,000. So our elephants were on the verge of extinction, as Jake said earlier. And our country, our government said at that moment, well, we'd rather have these animals alive than the ivory. We'd rather have live elephants. And we destroyed that entire stockpile of ivory, 12 tons, which resulted in the international ban on ivory trade, which Jake spoke of. And that killed the international demand, the fashions were changed, and as a result, poaching kind of dried up, the price of ivory collapsed, and elephant numbers began to recover. But last year, elephants were poached across Africa at a rate of 35,000 elephants. As an organization, we began to look at this problem and say, well, you know what, as Kenyans, we are responsible for holding our government to account. Our government must stop the killing of elephants. That means we've got to really work on excellence at the level of anti-poaching. But we also have to address the problem of the demand in China, when one or two of the individuals are being killed. We recently heard of a family in Sava where 6 elephants were killed. 4 of them didn't even have tusks. I mean, it is outrageous and brazen how these poachers are operating within our country. So there are three things that we concluded from our study. First, our government is not treating wildlife offences as serious crimes. Now, why is this important? Just you heard the British High Commissioner say, wildlife crimes are international crimes and they are organised crimes. It doesn't make sense that our courts are treating them as petty offences. The proceeds of the ivory trade are financing terrorism, the very reason why our tourism industry is in problems. Hundreds of poachers are arrested, very few ever get prosecuted because they pay off the police. And often the charges don't reflect the actual crimes. You might have a guy arrested in the park, he's got a gun, he's got a tusk, and he's charged with trespassing. That's what often happens, and this is, again, due to corruption. So there are several things we did. One was address the law itself. The penalty under the previous law was 40,000 shillings. It's now 20 million shillings if you're caught with ivory. That's the most severe penalty anywhere in the world. And we worked with parliamentarians and other conservation groups to have this effected. We've also worked with the Director of Public Prosecutions to address the problem of the quality of prosecutions. And he's created, for the first time in the history of Kenya, a special wildlife crime prosecution unit. 35 officers who are dedicated to wildlife crime. That is phenomenal. And we've also been working with the Chief Justice himself. So together with the DPP and the Chief Justice, we've started a series of dialogue meetings, conversations between the magistrates, the judges, the prosecutors, the investigators, the Wildlife Service, Kenya Revenue Authority, Ports Authority, everyone down the entire chain, including the communities and poachers themselves, to find solutions. In addition, we're starting, at the end of this month, the first integrated training course for prosecutors, investigators, and magistrates on the new wildlife legislation. This was a message from the Chief Justice himself. We stand to lose this national heritage if we do not act decisively to stop, once and for all, the unprecedented, senseless, and wanton killing of wild animals, and particularly elephants and rhinos, that are targeted for ivory and horn. I don't think we've ever heard a Chief Justice in this country talk about wildlife. I think it's really phenomenal that as conservationists, we usually just tend to talk amongst ourselves. For the first time, we're actually going outside of it and saying, you know what, these cannot be treated just as conservation crimes or wildlife crimes. These are far bigger than that, and we're getting the support from some very, very key government officials. But in addition, we've got a champion in the name of the First Lady, Margaret Kenyatta. And she has joined us to really bring a human face and to reach out to all Kenyans with empathy for elephants, starting with the baby elephants and also speaking to school children and visiting people in the field, walking with Jim Nyamu, and actually going to meet scientists on the ground. One of the three things that I would like to raise your attention to where I feel the tourism industry could be really instrumental in helping. One is messages to tourists themselves. And I talked about this with Nigel last year in October. So many tourists who come to this country have no idea, one, that the law is as severe as it is. A South Korean woman came wearing ivory earrings. She was charged with illegal possession of ivory in Kenya, and she was going to have to pay a fine of 20 million shillings. She paid 1 million shillings bail, and she just took off, went back to South Korea. She'll probably never come back to Kenya again. It's the wrong experience, really, for a tourist to be caught off guard. I think we really have to do a better job of informing and educating the tourists who come to this country in whichever way we do, whether it's through tickets, information on our websites, on our buses and all that kind of stuff. Secondly, we need support for these legal reforms. If we're going to save elephants, we really have to make the new law bite. It has to be really deterrent. It means we have to make sure that we catch more poachers and dealers, but we also have to make sure that they are punished for the crimes that they've committed. This requires an enormous amount of training over the next 3 years. We have a training program with the Judiciary Training Institute. And finally, what we'd love to see is the tourism industry partnering in a really meaningful way with the conservation sector. There are lots of things that could be done. For example, the distribution of the comic books. Information at the airports. We'd love to see that everyone who lands, as aircraft land in Nairobi airport, there are huge tourism-supported information boards saying, don't buy ivory, don't travel with ivory. Finally, to introduce you to an incredible animal. I should say person. His name is Tim. He lives in Amboseli. He's 46 years old. He is just amazing. He lives in the park, but he leaves the park and he wanders for hundreds of kilometers. He is followed by those rangers every single day. And Tim is the father of most of the baby elephants in Amboseli. So I hope that you will bring visitors to meet individuals like Tim, not just elephants in general, but individuals who have a name and a story. Thank you.